At Christmas dinner, I overheard my parents planning to move my sister's family into my $350,000 condo for free. I smiled and stayed silent. I let them pack and brag, then I sold it and vanished. 78 missed calls. Christmas dinner at my parents' house always followed the same script. The smell of roasted turkey clung to the curtains. Bing Crosby hummed softly from an old speaker in the corner. My mother fussed over the table settings like she was preparing for royalty, and my father poured wine a little too generously, already laughing louder than necessary. I arrived on time carrying a wrapped bottle of wine and a carefully practiced smile. I had learned long ago that smiling kept the peace. Made things easier. My sister Laura arrived late as usual, with her husband and their 2 kids in tow, arms full of gifts and excuses. Everyone greeted them like heroes who just survived a war. "Oh, you made it," my mother exclaimed, pulling Laura into a hug. We were worried. No one ever worried about me. Dinner was loud and crowded. Plates clinked. Kids argued over roles. My father made the same jokes he'd been making for 20 years. I sat there politely, nodding, laughing at the right moments, feeling like a guest in a family I technically belonged to. Halfway through the meal, I stood to refill my water and walked toward the kitchen. That's when I heard it. My parents' voices, lowered, careful, drifting from the hallway near the pantry. "She doesn't need all that space anyway," my mother whispered. My father chuckled. "Exactly. It's perfect for Laura and the kids. She'll understand. She always does." I stopped walking. My hand tightened around the glass. "We'll wait until after Christmas to tell her," my mother continued. "Once they start packing, it'll be too late to change her mind." Packing. A chill ran through me, sharp and sudden. I didn't need to hear my name to know who they were talking about. My condo. My $350,000 condo. The one I bought alone. The one I worked for while skipping vacations, overtime stacking into years, life shrinking so that future security could grow. I stood there, invisible, listening as my parents casually planned to move my sister's family into my home, without asking me. Not a discussion. Not a question. A decision. I could have spoken up. I could have stormed back into the dining room, demanded answers, caused a scene. Everyone would have stared. Laura would have cried. My parents would have sighed and told me I was being dramatic. Instead, I took a breath. I filled my glass. I walked back to the table. I smiled. I raised my glass when my father called for a toast. I laughed when my sister bragged about exciting changes coming soon. And as the Christmas lights twinkled and everyone celebrated togetherness, I made a quiet decision of my own. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to let them believe they'd already won. That condo wasn't just a place to live. It was proof. Proof that I could stand on my own without anyone catching me when I fell. I bought it 6 years earlier, signing the papers alone in a quiet office that smelled faintly of printer ink and stale coffee. No parents. No sister. No husband. Just me, a pen, and years of disciplined choices finally paying off. When the agent congratulated me, I nodded politely, then cried in my car afterward, not out of sadness but relief. I had worked for that place inch by inch. While others spent freely, I budgeted obsessively. I took on extra shifts. I passed on weekend trips and destination weddings. I lived in a cramped apartment with unreliable heat because it was cheaper, telling myself it was temporary. Every sacrifice had a purpose, and that purpose eventually became a set of keys placed gently in my palm. The condo sat in a quiet, well-kept complex near downtown. 2 bedrooms. Sunlight that poured through the windows in the morning. A small balcony where I drank coffee before work and reminded myself that peace could be earned. It was modest by some standards, luxurious by mine. More importantly, it was mine. My parents had congratulated me when I bought it. Proud smiles. Photos taken. My sister had joked about visiting all the time, laughing as if it were harmless. At the time I laughed too. I didn't realize jokes sometimes double as warnings. Laura's life had followed a different path. She married young. Had kids quickly. Money was always tight. There was always a reason she needed help. A loan that never got repaid. A temporary stay that lasted months. My parents filled in the gaps quietly and consistently, never asking her to adjust, only expecting others to. Me, on the other hand, I was the responsible one. The one who didn't need help. The one who would understand. That label followed me everywhere, sticking tighter with every success I earned on my own. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the assumption. The unspoken belief that because I had built something myself, I owed it to everyone else. That my hard work was a shared resource, not a personal victory. As I sat at that Christmas table watching my sister's children smear gravy across their plates, I realized something painful and clarifying. To my family, my condo wasn't a milestone. It wasn't a symbol of independence. It was an available solution. A spare asset. Something they felt entitled to rearrange without me in the room. And in that moment, I understood exactly what was at stake. Not just my home, but the life I had quietly, carefully built to finally belong to myself. I learned very early where I stood in my family. Not because anyone ever said it out loud, but because it was always shown. Laura was 3 years younger than me, which meant she was still the baby long after she had babies of her own. She cried and the world stopped. She struggled and everyone rushed in. Her mistakes were framed as bad luck. Her poor decisions softened with explanations and sympathy. I, on the other hand, was praised for being easy. "You've always been so independent," my mother loved to say, as if it were a compliment and not a quiet dismissal. Independence meant I didn't complain. It meant I handled things myself. It meant no one worried about whether I was okay. When Laura forgot rent, my parents helped. When her car broke down, my father drove across town in the middle of the night. When her marriage hit rough patches, the entire family gathered around her like a protective shield. Meanwhile, I paid my bills, fixed my own problems, and learned not to ask for more than I was offered. At family gatherings, Laura's life was the main attraction. Stories about her kids, her stress, her plans. Everyone leaned in, listening. My achievements were acknowledged politely, then brushed aside. A promotion. A bonus. Buying a home. "That's nice, dear," followed by a quick change of subject. Over time, I stopped bringing things up. I learned that shrinking myself kept the peace. What hurt most wasn't jealousy. I didn't want Laura's life. I didn't envy the chaos, the constant financial strain, the way she was always waiting for someone else to fix things. What hurt was the imbalance. The expectation that I would always bend because I could. That expectation hardened into something dangerous. When Laura needed help, it wasn't discussed, it was assumed. When sacrifices were required, they were never shared evenly. Somehow they always landed in my lap. I was expected to understand. To be generous. To step aside quietly. So when my parents planned to give my condo to Laura's family, it didn't come from nowhere. It was the natural conclusion of a dynamic that had been building for decades. The golden child would be rescued. The invisible one would absorb the cost. Sitting at that Christmas table, I finally saw it clearly. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a pattern. One I had helped reinforce by staying silent for too long. And for the first time, instead of swallowing that familiar ache and calling it love, I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. What would happen if I stopped playing my part? I told myself I had already heard enough. That whatever they were planning, I could confront it later. After the holidays. In private. Like a reasonable adult. But then my mother laughed softly. "It's really perfect timing," she said. "The kids need stability and Laura's been so stressed. This will fix everything." Fix everything. My father murmured his agreement. "Once they're settled in, she won't uproot them. She's not heartless." That word landed like a quiet accusation. Not heartless. Meaning I wouldn't dare say no once children were involved. Once boxes were stacked. Once promises were made on my behalf. I stayed frozen, half hidden near the kitchen doorway, my pulse thudding in my ears. They weren't debating whether this was fair. They were discussing logistics. "Which bedroom should the boys take?" my mother asked. "The larger one," my father replied without hesitation. "They'll need the space. And Laura and Mark can use the master," she continued. "It already has that nice walk-in closet." My walk-in closet. I felt something shift inside me then. Not an explosion of anger, but a heavy, settling clarity. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a fully formed plan. Thought through. Agreed upon. All without me. "They'll save so much money," my mother added. "No rent, no pressure. She can finally breathe." "And she can," my father said carefully, "once things calm down, find somewhere else. Eventually. Eventually. A word with no deadline. No accountability. I thought about the years I had spent carefully building my life. The spreadsheets. The nights I lay awake calculating expenses. The stress I carried alone so no one else had to worry about me. None of that mattered in this moment. All they saw was an opportunity. A solution. A resource they could redistribute. I realized then that they didn't see my condo as my home. They saw it as excess. Something I had because I could. Something that could be reassigned to someone who needed it more. Behind me, laughter erupted from the dining room. Laura's voice rose above the others as she talked about big changes coming soon. I wondered how much she already knew. Whether she was in on the plan, or simply trusting our parents to deliver what they'd promised her. I could have walked in and stopped it. I could have said my name out loud, reminded them I existed. But standing there, listening to them map out my life without me, I understood something painfully simple. If I spoke now, I would be cast as the villain. The selfish one. The obstacle to family harmony. So I stayed quiet. I let them finish planning. And as they decided my future for me in hushed voices, I made a decision of my own. One they would never hear coming. I walked back into the dining room carrying my water like nothing had happened. My face felt strangely calm, as if it had already made peace with a truth my heart was still catching up to. "Everything okay?" my mother asked, glancing up as I took my seat. "Perfect," I said and surprised myself by meaning it. At least on the surface. Conversation flowed around me. The kids were arguing over dessert. My father was refilling glasses. Laura leaned back in her chair, one hand resting casually on her stomach, laughing as she talked about how cramped their current place felt. "It's just not working anymore," she said loudly. "We need more space. Somewhere the kids can really grow." My parents exchanged a knowing look. I noticed everything now. The careful pauses, the loaded smiles, the way my mother avoided my eyes when Laura spoke. They were all acting like the hardest part was already over. I nodded at the right moments. Asked the right questions. Played my role so well that even I almost forgot what I'd overheard. Inside though, something was sharpening. They spoke freely because they believed they were safe. They assumed my silence meant agreement or at least resignation. They believed, as they always had, that I would fall in line once the plan was revealed. Laura's husband mentioned how lucky they were to have such supportive parents. My father beamed. My mother squeezed Laura's hand. "And family helps family," my mother added, her voice light but pointed. "That's what matters." I smiled and lifted my fork. What they didn't realize was that silence can be a strategy. Can be armor. Can be the space where decisions quietly take shape. Every word they said gave me more clarity. Every assumption they made hardened my resolve. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was observing. Laura talked about schools near my condo. My condo. She joked about how nice it would be not to pay rent for a while. My parents laughed, already picturing themselves as saviors. No one asked me a single question. By the time dessert was served, the initial sting had dulled into something colder and steadier. I understood the rules of the game I was in. Confrontation would only trigger guilt, tears, and accusations of selfishness. So I chose patience. I smiled through coffee. I complimented the food. I helped clear plates. I hugged everyone goodbye with the same warmth I always had. And as I drove home that night, the Christmas lights blurring past my windshield, I wasn't replaying what they had done to me. I was thinking about what I was going to do next. They believed my silence meant surrender. They had no idea it meant preparation. The days after Christmas moved quickly, almost too quickly. It was as if the plan I'd overheard had flipped a switch, giving everyone permission to act without restraint. Laura called me 3 days later. Her voice was bright, rehearsed. "So, things are finally happening," she said. "Mom mentioned you'd probably hear about it soon anyway." "Probably." I murmured something neutral, letting her talk. She filled the silence easily, explaining how relieved she felt, how the kids were excited, how hard the past year had been on them. She never asked how I felt. She never asked if I was okay with any of it. Boxes began to appear in my parents' garage. My mother sent photos to the family group chat, neatly labeled, stacked high. "Getting organized early," she wrote, followed by a heart emoji. Early for what exactly was never clarified. Relatives chimed in with encouragement. Comments about fresh starts. About how lucky Laura was. About how wonderful it was that everything worked out. I read every message in silence, my phone heavy in my hand. At Sunday lunch the following week, the story had grown legs. My aunt asked Laura if she needed help decorating the new place. A cousin joked about finally having room for family gatherings. My father proudly explained how everything had been handled. Like paperwork. Like logistics. Like I was a detail, not a person. Laura's children started talking about which room they wanted. One wanted the room with the balcony. The other wanted the one closest to the bathroom. I smiled and nodded, my chest tight, my mind clear. No one noticed I hadn't offered keys. No one noticed I hadn't said yes. They didn't need my permission anymore. Not in their minds. They had already moved in emotionally. Physically, it was just a matter of time. What amazed me most wasn't their confidence. It was their comfort. The complete absence of doubt. They weren't worried I might object. They weren't afraid of consequences. Years of conditioning had taught them I wouldn't disrupt the narrative. And maybe once upon a time they would have been right. I let the bragging continue. I let the plans solidify. I let them tell people. The deeper they committed, the clearer my path became. Every packed box was proof. Every public assumption was leverage. Every careless comment confirmed that confrontation now would only paint me as cruel. So I stayed quiet. I answered messages politely. I smiled at photos of boxes and scribbled labels. I listened as my mother talked about how grateful Laura was. Grateful for something that wasn't hers. They thought I was being generous. That I was finally stepping into the role they had written for me. But in reality I was doing something far more dangerous. I was letting them get comfortable. And comfort, I knew, made people careless. There was one detail no one ever bothered to ask about. Not my parents. Not Laura. Not even her husband. The condo wasn't just mine emotionally. It was mine legally, completely, and without conditions. I had learned early, watching my parents entangle finances with family, that clarity mattered. When I bought the condo, I made sure every document reflected a single name. My name. No co-signers. No shared ownership. No quiet assumptions hiding in fine print. While everyone else was packing boxes and making plans, I made an appointment with my attorney. His office was small and unassuming, tucked above a coffee shop downtown. I'd worked with him years earlier on a simple will just in case. When I told him what was happening, he didn't look surprised. "You'd be amazed how often this happens," he said calmly, flipping through my file. "Family hears property and stops hearing ownership." We reviewed everything carefully. The deed. The mortgage, paid off faster than scheduled. The HOA rules. The leasing restrictions. No legal obligation. No loopholes. No claim anyone else could make. "Bottom line," he said, meeting my eyes, "no one can move in without your consent. And you can do whatever you want with the property. Whatever I want." Those words followed me home, echoing louder with every mile. For years I had framed my choices around responsibility. What was sensible, what was fair, what kept the peace. It hadn't occurred to me that wanting could be a valid reason. That night I sat alone on my couch, looking around the space I had built my life in. The books on the shelves. The photos I'd chosen. The quiet I had earned. I imagined it filled with noise, chaos, resentment. My sanctuary turned into a favor I'd be expected to smile about. I opened my laptop and ran the numbers. Sale value. Capital gains. Market demand. The numbers were strong. Stronger than I'd expected. An idea began to form. Not impulsive, not emotional, but deliberate. I slept on it. Then another night. And another. While my family talked about move-in dates and room assignments, I gathered information. I spoke to a realtor recommended by a colleague. She toured the condo, praised its condition, suggested a price that made my stomach flip. "This will go fast," she said confidently. I nodded, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. They thought my silence meant permission. They thought my calm meant agreement. They never considered that I was consulting professionals instead of relatives. Never imagined that while they were packing boxes I was preparing paperwork. They believed the condo was already theirs in everything but name. What they didn't know was that the most important decisions had already been made, quietly, legally, and entirely without them. Making the decision wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no tears splashed across the kitchen floor. Just a slow, steady acceptance that something fundamental had shifted. For days I walked through my condo with new eyes. I traced the edges of the counters I'd installed myself. I stood on the balcony at sunrise, coffee warming my hands, watching the city wake up below. This place had sheltered me through exhaustion, loneliness, and pride. Letting it go felt like saying goodbye to a version of myself. But it also felt like reclaiming her. Every time doubt crept in, it brought guilt with it. Their family. The kids need space. You can manage. Those voices were familiar. They sounded like my parents. Like my own conscience trained to prioritize everyone else. Then I asked myself a different question. If this condo truly belonged to me, why did it feel like I needed permission to keep it? The answer settled quietly but firmly. Because I had been taught that my success was communal while my boundaries were optional. I met with the realtor again 2 days later. She spread comparable listings across my dining table, her finger tapping numbers that made my pulse quicken. "This is a great time to sell," she said. "Interest is high. You're in a strong position." Strong position. I signed the listing agreement with steady hands. The pen felt heavier than I expected, but when it left the paper, something loosened in my chest. Once the decision was made, everything else became practical. Professional photos. Minor touch-ups. A schedule of showings. I moved a few personal items into storage, packing quietly, carefully, as if performing a ritual only I understood. No one in my family noticed anything different. They were too busy planning a future that, in their minds, was already secure. Laura sent me a message about curtain colors. My mother asked if the kids would need new bedding. I replied politely. Non-committal. Kind. The condo went on the market on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon there were multiple offers. I sat alone on the couch, phone in my hand, staring at the realtor's text as reality settled in. This wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was happening. I accepted an offer that night. Above asking price. Clean terms. A quick closing. As I signed the final documents, a surprising emotion rose up. Not fear, not regret, but relief. For the first time in years, my future felt unentangled. They believed they were moving into my life. In truth, I was stepping out of the role they had written for me, and selling the stage beneath their feet. The closing date arrived quietly without ceremony. No dramatic countdown. No warning signs flashing in the sky. Just an email in my inbox confirming what I already knew. The condo was officially sold. I woke up early that morning, earlier than usual, and sat on the edge of my bed listening to the city hum outside. For a moment, I felt suspended between two lives. The one I was leaving and the one I hadn't fully stepped into yet. I packed the last of my things methodically. Clothes folded. Documents organized. Nothing rushed. Nothing emotional. I left the place clean, empty, and neutral, as if I had never lived there at all. Before I locked the door for the final time, I stood in the living room and let the silence settle. No voices planning my future. No expectations pressing in from all sides. Just quiet. I placed the keys on the counter for the realtor, closed the door behind me, and didn't look back. That afternoon I transferred the funds. The number on my screen was surreal. Solid, real, entirely mine. I moved the money where it belonged, accounts my parents didn't know about, accounts Laura had never heard of. Safety first. Clarity always. Then I did something I had never done before. I turned my phone off. No family group chats. No follow-up questions. No cheerful assumptions. I didn't owe anyone an explanation yet. Not until the facts were unchangeable. I checked into a small extended-stay hotel across town, the kind meant for people in transition. Temporary. Anonymous. Perfect. I unpacked just enough to feel human, then sat on the bed, staring at the blank wall. It felt strange to be unreachable. Unavailable. For years I had been the first one to answer, the one who smoothed things over, the one who made space. Now I was gone. Not physically far, but emotionally, legally, decisively. That evening I walked to a nearby cafe and ordered dinner alone. I watched couples talk and families laugh, completely unaware of the quiet rebellion unfolding in my life. The world hadn't stopped. It never does. When I turned my phone back on the next morning, it vibrated immediately. Missed calls. Messages. Voicemails. My mother's name appeared first. Then my father's. Then Laura's. Over and over again. I didn't listen. Not yet. I already knew what they were saying. Confusion first. Then panic. Then anger. Because in their story I wasn't supposed to vanish. I was supposed to wait patiently while they moved into my life. But while they were busy packing boxes and making plans, I had done something they never anticipated. I had stepped out of reach. And now there was nothing left for them to move into at all. By the time I finally sat down and opened my phone, the number at the top of the screen made me pause. 78 missed calls. I stared at it, strangely detached, as if it belonged to someone else. Beneath the calls were messages, dozens of them, stacked so tightly they blurred together. My mother's came first. Call me immediately. This is not funny. We need to talk. Then my father's, shorter and sharper. What's going on? Where are you? You're causing unnecessary stress. Laura's messages came in waves. At first, confusion. Hey, what's happening with the condo? Mom says you're not answering. Then irritation. This isn't okay. The kids are excited. And finally, anger. You can't just disappear like this. We already told everyone. That line stuck with me. We already told everyone. As if public commitment somehow replaced consent. As if embarrassment was leverage. Voicemails followed the same progression. My mother crying. My father demanding explanations. Laura accusing me of being selfish, dramatic, cruel. I listened to none of them. Instead, I scrolled quietly, absorbing the shift in tone. The moment when their confidence cracked. The point where assumption turned into fear. Because now something didn't add up. The keys hadn't been delivered. The condo wasn't accessible. The silence wasn't temporary, it was final. I imagined them standing in my parents' living room, boxes stacked high, trying to reach me while the reality crept in. I imagined the questions from relatives. The awkward pauses. The dawning understanding that something had gone wrong. For years, I had responded instantly to crises that weren't mine. I had dropped everything to soothe tempers, fix mistakes, fill gaps. This time I stayed still. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. I needed them to feel the weight of their assumptions before I spoke. To experience the discomfort of plans made without permission. Late that night, my phone buzzed again. A single message from Laura stood out. Please just tell us what's going on. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just panic wrapped in politeness. I set the phone face down on the table and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. My breathing calm. I wasn't hiding anymore. I wasn't running. I was choosing the timing of my own voice for the first time in my life. Tomorrow I would speak. But tonight I let the unanswered calls sit there, silent proof that boundaries, once crossed, don't always come with immediate explanations. Sometimes they arrive as consequences. I waited until the next morning. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted my words to land clearly, without shaking hands or borrowed guilt. When I finally picked up my phone, the silence felt intentional, earned. I called my parents first. My mother answered on the first ring, breathless. Where have you been? We've been worried sick. I'm fine, I said calmly. But we need to talk. There was a pause, long enough for hope to creep in on her end. So, about the condo, she began, already framing it as a misunderstanding. There is no condo, I replied. Not anymore. The line went quiet. What do you mean? My father demanded, his voice suddenly sharp. I sold it, I said. The sale closed yesterday. My mother gasped, a sound caught somewhere between shock and outrage. My father spoke over her. You had no right. We already made arrangements. That's exactly the problem, I said, keeping my tone even. You made arrangements about my home without asking me. They talked at once then. Panic, disbelief, anger colliding. Accusations surfaced quickly. How could I do this to family? What about the kids? Didn't I understand how hard things were for Laura? I let them finish. When the noise finally died down, I spoke again. I worked for that condo. I paid for it. And I never agreed to give it away. My mother's voice softened, shifting strategies. We assumed you'd be okay with it. You always are. That assumption, I said quietly, is why this happened. Laura joined the call shortly after. She didn't greet me. She launched straight into disbelief. So you just decided to blow everything up? We were counting on that place. I know, I said. And that's what scares me. She accused me of being heartless. Of choosing money over family. Of embarrassing her in front of everyone. I didn't embarrass you, I replied. I didn't promise you something that wasn't mine to give. Silence followed. Thick, uncomfortable, unfamiliar. For the first time, I wasn't explaining myself into knots. I wasn't apologizing for protecting what was mine. I wasn't shrinking to make the conversation easier. I love you, I said finally. But I won't be volunteered anymore. My life isn't a backup plan. No one responded right away. When the call ended, my hands were still steady. My chest felt light, not because it was over but because something else was. For the first time, I hadn't begged to be understood. I had simply told the truth and let it stand on its own. The backlash didn't come all at once. It trickled in message by message, call by call, like a slow leak turning into a flood. Within hours of that conversation, the tone shifted completely. Confusion hardened into blame. Concern transformed into outrage. My phone lit up with messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. How could you do this right after Christmas? Those kids need stability. Family doesn't treat family this way. No one asked what had happened. No one asked why I felt cornered. They had been told a story and I had already been cast as the villain. My parents stopped calling and started texting, long paragraphs filled with disappointment. My mother wrote about sacrifice and loyalty. My father accused me of being cold, calculating, ungrateful. Laura was the loudest. She sent voice messages through tears, then rage. She reminded me of every time she had been there for me, every birthday she remembered, every favor she believed she had earned interest on. She told me I'd ruined her children's sense of security. I listened once. Never again. What struck me wasn't the anger. It was the entitlement beneath it. None of them said we should have asked. None of them said we were wrong. The outrage wasn't about losing my condo. It was about losing control over me. At one point, my mother called and left a voicemail that ended with, "I don't recognize you anymore." I replayed that line twice. Neither did I. The woman they were angry at wasn't new. She had always been there, quietly enduring, quietly adjusting. The difference now was that she had stopped bending. I wanted to defend myself. To explain again. To remind them that love doesn't include entitlement. That generosity isn't an obligation. That boundaries aren't betrayal. But I didn't. Because every message they sent confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about access. And access had been revoked. I muted the group chats. I archived the emails. I stopped responding to accusations disguised as concern. Each small act of disengagement felt like lifting weight off my shoulders. For years, I had been afraid that saying no would cost me my family. What I didn't realize was that always saying yes had been costing me myself. As the noise faded, something else filled the space. Clarity. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't selfish. I was simply no longer available for exploitation dressed up as love. And once that truth settled in, their anger stopped sounding like judgment. It sounded like loss. When the noise finally died down, I expected to feel lonely. Instead, I felt quiet. Not the heavy, aching kind of quiet that follows grief, but a clean, open stillness. The kind you don't realize you've been craving until it finally arrives. I moved out of the hotel and into a small furnished apartment across town. It wasn't permanent, but it was mine in a way my condo had stopped being long before I sold it. No memories attached. No expectations lingering in the corners. I slept better almost immediately. Mornings became slower. I drank my coffee without checking my phone first. I took walks without replaying conversations in my head. The constant tension I'd carried for years, waiting to be needed, waiting to be asked, waiting to be judged, began to loosen its grip. With the sale money safely tucked away, I made decisions based on preference instead of obligation. I met with a financial planner, not because I was afraid but because I was curious. For the first time, my future wasn't a family committee project. I started saying no without rehearsing explanations. No to last-minute favors. No to guilt-heavy invitations. No to being the solution everyone else leaned on. And with every no, something unexpected happened. I gained time. Time to reconnect with friends I'd slowly drifted from. Time to take a class I'd always postponed. Time to sit with myself without distraction, without justification. I realized how much of my energy had gone into managing other people's comfort. How many of my choices had been shaped around not rocking the boat. Walking away didn't make me harder. It made me clearer. I wasn't angry all the time anymore. I wasn't bracing myself for the next request. I wasn't calculating how much of myself I could give without resentment creeping in. The space I created wasn't empty. It was fertile. I filled it with routines that felt good instead of necessary. with conversations that didn't leave me drained, with plans that belonged only to me. And slowly, a new version of my life began to take shape, one that didn't require permission or justification or sacrifice as proof of love. I hadn't lost my family. I had lost the role I was assigned. And in its place, I gained something I hadn't realized I'd been missing all along. Peace. The kind that doesn't come from agreement, but from alignment with yourself. Life didn't collapse for them overnight. It rarely does. Instead, it adjusted, awkwardly, uncomfortably, and without the safety net they had counted on. Laura stayed with my parents longer than planned. What was supposed to be a brief transition stretched into months. Boxes cluttered hallways. The kids fought over space that never quite felt like theirs. Tension crept into daily routines, small irritations compounding into quiet resentment. Without my condo as an option, reality set in. Rent prices were higher than Laura expected. Savings thinner. Promises harder to keep. The certainty she'd carried, that someone would always step in, began to crack. My parents too felt the shift. They tried to smooth things over at first, telling relatives it was all a misunderstanding. That I had overreacted. That I'd come around eventually. But time passed and I didn't. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations were declined politely or not at all. The absence of my compliance forced them to confront something uncomfortable. They could no longer make decisions for me and expect quiet agreement. I heard bits and pieces through mutual acquaintances. My father remembered the condo differently now, insisting he had only suggested the idea. My mother reframed the story, telling friends she was heartbroken, that I had pulled away. No one mentioned consent. No one mentioned ownership. Laura, I later learned, had started looking for work again. Seriously this time. The kind that came with schedules and accountability. She complained to a cousin about how unfair it was that life had become so hard all at once. I didn't take satisfaction in that. There was no triumph in watching consequences unfold. Just a quiet acknowledgement that choices, mine and theirs, had finally been remembered. Occasionally a message would slip through. A carefully worded apology that wasn't quite an apology. A suggestion that we move forward without addressing the past. An invitation designed to restore normalcy without repairing trust. I declined those too. Not out of spite but out of clarity. Normal had never worked for me. What struck me most was how quickly the narrative changed once I was no longer participating. Without my silence to smooth things over, tensions surfaced everywhere. The family dynamic adjusted, redistributing strain that had once been absorbed quietly by me. They were learning, slowly and reluctantly, what happens when the person who always carries the weight finally sets it down. And for the first time the imbalance was visible. Not because I pointed it out, but because I wasn't there to hide it anymore. It took me a long time to understand that love and obligation are not the same thing. For most of my life I confused the two. I believed that being a good daughter meant being agreeable. That being a good sister meant being available. That being a good person meant sacrificing quietly and calling it generosity. No one ever told me otherwise. And because I was capable, reliable, and steady, my boundaries blurred until they practically disappeared. What I learned, too late but not too late to matter, is that people get used to what you allow. Not because they're evil or intentionally cruel, but because comfort dulls awareness. When you always step in, no one notices the cost to you. You stop. Setting boundaries doesn't make you unloving. It makes your love honest. It separates what you choose to give from what others assume they can take. I used to think saying no would shatter relationships. That it would make me selfish, difficult, or cold. What I didn't see was that relationships built on silent sacrifice are already fractured. They just hide it well. Walking away wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about choosing myself in a space where I had always been an afterthought. If you see yourself in this story, if you're the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who's always expected to adjust, hear this clearly. Your life is not communal property. Your success is not an invitation. Your boundaries are not betrayal. You don't need to burn bridges or make speeches. Sometimes the most powerful change happens quietly, through action rather than argument. I didn't lose my family because I sold my condo. I lost the version of myself that believed love meant compliance. And in exchange I gained something far more valuable than approval or peacekeeping. I gained ownership of my choices, my future, and my worth. If I could go back, I would tell myself this sooner. But since I can't, I'll tell you now. Protect what you build. Not everyone who benefits from your sacrifices deserves access to them. And choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's overdue.